Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life, not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at Facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube and tunein.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. Oh yeah, we might also be on Spotify now. I'm not entirely sure how that works. If you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll inspire Apple to promote us a little. And of course, you can also promote us by telling people about the podcast on social media or however else you publicize the things you like. You can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/VMSPod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. I finally wrapped all the business travel this month on the flight home from Montreal Thursday, which of course was delayed. I went over my calendar and realized that I've been on the road for a third of the month. And I know other people have tougher business travel schedules and still other people have real jobs, but this has been kind of wearing. Still, it's all done for the nonce. I didn't miss a week of the show. And during some of that airport time, I got a neat idea for a new writing project if I can just get the time and focus to work on it. Now, this week's show features artist and illustrator Dave Culver. Dave recently published his first graphic novel, Limbo Lounge, from Yo Books and Top Shelf. Yo is Y-O-E, named after the publisher, Craig Yo. Limbo Lounge is about a guy who dies, and he winds up in hell and finds a path to the Limbo Lounge. Oh, and in hell, he's got a flower for a head. A lot of people turn out to have weird bodies down there as part of the devil's joke on mankind. It is a very charming and macabre book simultaneously. The various denizens of the Limbo Lounge share their stories, try to figure out some way out of their situation, and otherwise just try to get by in this, well, sort of tiki lounge atmosphere for the rest of time. Now, in addition to being a fun and nicely crafted story, Dave's artwork is beyond gorgeous, which befits someone who's been a pro in magazine illustration and book covers for like 40 years. But you'll find yourself lingering over some of the spreads and panoramas of the phantasmagoria that he draws. He has this amazing colored pencil technique and style that's just amazing to look at. There's also close-up moments of these, well, flower-headed people and other types, and he manages to convey real human suffering and folly at the same time. It'll really draw you in. Dave has an amazing graphic sensibility, and he incorporates and perverts all sorts of pop influences. Now, I got turned on to Dave Calver by Roz Chast, the great New Yorker cartoonist whom I've recorded with a few times. She went to art school with Dave, and after our recent live session at Mocha Festival, Roz clued me into Limbo Lounge and vouched for Dave as a fun potential guest of the show. Dave lives out in Palm Springs, but he was coming back east for a book event, so we got together in New York last month to record. Now, he was staying at the home of another friend from art school, RISD, by the way. Her name is Kathy B. Graham, and Kathy is also an artist who I'm now hoping to record with sometime this summer. A book about her came out last year. It's called Second Bloom. It's published by Vendome. Anyway, Dave and I got together one rainy Saturday morning. His publisher, Craig Yo, dropped by with his son around the same time, so we all shot the breeze for a bit off mic before Craig and his kid headed out and we started the episode, which is why Dave mentions Craig a few times during the conversation. As other caveats go, we had the mics on kind of a low coffee table, so the audio levels aren't great. I did my best, and again, if you don't like it, please contact me and I'll get you your money back. Now here's Dave's bio. Dave Calver's rich, evocative, surreal work has been featured in Vanity Fair, Rolling Stone, Playboy, and the New York Times. Other clients include the New York Rangers, Random House, and United Airlines. Taschen chose him as one of their favorite 100 illustrators in the world, and in the Huffington Post review of Taschen's 100 illustrators, they singled out Dave as their #1 top favorite. Limbo Lounge is Dave's first graphic novel. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Dave Calver. Well, we may as well start with the Limbo Lounge.
Sure.
Where did it begin for you, and what was the process of working in comics as opposed to working in illustration?
Well, things in illustration kind of slowed down, it seemed to me, and a lot of other illustrators that I've talked to at the time, right around 9/11. It coincided, I think, with economic things that were going on. And all of a sudden, magazines were folding, and illustration work just started to kind of dry up. And so I ended up getting into more gallery work, and especially when I moved out here in 2006, I think, and I reconnected with an old friend, Brad Benedict, who he's done a lot of illustration books. He did the Blue Book, Fame, Phonographics, and he had a store called Heaven on Melrose. Real character. He had Paper Moon Graphics, and he was doing a commemorative show of what I think may have been the first pop surrealism lowbrow show, celebrating illustrators in particular as fine artists in Japan, at the Floret Museum. And when I moved to Palm Springs, he was in LA and encouraged me to do some work for that show. And one thing I started doing for that show and other gallery shows that came after that was a series involving flower characters that were behaving badly. You know, the very first one was a flower at the end of a bar, and he was all banged up. He had on a bandit mask, and his petals were all torn, and I called it black-eyed boozin'. And that moved on, and people liked it. And so I did more and more of those characters. And I realized I should try a graphic novel since I had the time. And since those characters seemed to be popular, I started thinking about some kind of flower character. And it all evolved very gradually. I had actually about 6 years, I think, from start to finish. And I started experimenting with the flower characters. And I was telling Roz the other night, the first ones I did were very much like the ones in the gallery series, where they had not only flower heads, but also stems for bodies, yeah, and leaves for arms and little roots for feet. And it just didn't carry the weight visually on the page. And so I gave them human bodies, yeah, with just flower heads. And then it grew from there, thinking, well, why are they look like humans, but they have flower heads, and then that evolved into punishment. And then I had all kinds of freedom from there to do anything as a head, and any background character as anything. And it unfolded very gradually, but the more I worked on it, the clearer that world seemed to me, and it became clear where I should go with it.
And was that the first long-form storytelling you'd done? Because I going through your work, everything seems illustrative as opposed to sequential. So.
I had never, and anytime I had tried to do anything sequential, I had trouble with the continuity, especially with human characters. And that's another reason,
That was the guy who did the comic book in the 80s, Reed Fleming, World's Toughest Milkman. It's a great indie comic, but he said if I knew it was going to be a success for a while, I wouldn't have given him that nose. Because drawing this boxy nose again and again and again, just from every angle, drove him insane.
I can understand. And, flower's much easier, except for all those petals. The flower part was not too bad. And the nun, who's a human, is mostly covered and elderly, and she's got the bifocals. So she was kind of easy. And that little girl I had done versions of for years. So I didn't have... I made it easier for myself intentionally.
But still, the act of coming up with a story and developing something like this, just out of the blue for you, midlife crisis-y sort of thing. I know you mentioned the illustration business is down, but most people's response to that isn't, I've got it, I'll make my first graphic novel.
I know. Well, it wasn't quite that deliberate, but... in particular, when we moved down to where we are now, that vintage trailer park, I would go often to the local coffee shop and just work on the graphic novel, and a movie project. And shortly after I was working on it, I reconnected with Craig at a Comic-Con, and I had never met him, even though we had worked together and talked together over the years. And he said, so what's going on? I said, well, I'm working on this graphic novel. And he said, I want to publish it. He was in a position with IDW where they were looking to do a graphic novel with Yo Books. And very shortly after that, IDW bought or collaborated with Top Shelf. Yeah. And so they had an instant, graphic novel division. And Chris Starrows became my editor, and was wonderful. But it all was it just happened. I was in the right place at the right time with Craig, and I met Chris the following year, and luckily he liked it and we clicked. He's a nice guy. And Justin Eisinger is the senior book editor at IDW, and he and I clicked. And he pointed out what I hadn't intended as the Shining references with the elderly bartenders, and I hadn't intended. But as a nod to that, for Justin, I had the other thing from The Shining where one of the goons is down on the floor in front of the other goon.
The furry scene.
Exactly. That was very much to give Justin a chuckle.
I know it's a small sample set for you, but comics editors versus art directors in terms of your experience? I mean, you had decades more experience with art directors.
Yeah. I was extremely pleasantly surprised with Chris. He was he liked everything.
Yeah.
And he had a few very reasonable suggestions, including the end, which the original ending, I didn't have Lou coming back to life. I just ended it very quietly with Lou's beam of, life going back into the universe. And then, everything ended after a very gradual transition into whiteness. And that was it. But he liked the idea of having one of them live. Yeah. And I kind of love how he was dying and then comes back. And, you see the globe next to him, Earth, and him looking happy. And I liked that it ended positively, and kind of. I don't know how other people feel about it, because who knows what happens, but I kind of wanted to make a nod toward reincarnation, which, but
and it's a very casually macabre book.
Yeah.
In a lot of respects. I mean, you've got this concepts thrown off of, eternal damnation and punishment and all this. So it's nice to have a hopeful moment in the midst of all that.
And back on Earth. And then beyond. Yeah.
Are you happy with the book overall?
Yeah. I was mentioning to you and Craig earlier, I read it quietly last night for the first time, maybe ever. After all of this, I've flipped through it and been pleased, but, I kind of digested it last night, and, I was really happy with it. It's fairly simple, I think, and, but challenging in some ways to follow, and, a little provocative in some ways. And I like that it's not superheroes. That's one reason I hadn't even thought about a graphic novel for a while. But when I started seeing people like Charles Burns and Lorenzo Mattotti.
I think I gave you one of my Mattotti cards over there.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Oh, I'm a huge fan of his work. Visually, I just think it's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, he is legendary. Just to see the fashion drawings, the cartooning, just
amazing.
He's phenomenal. He's one of those guys I was so thankful to get, even though English is his third, fourth, fifth language. I sort of toned down my typical shtick, just to make it simple enough that he was going to get it. But he was a good guest.
Effusive.
Yeah.
I would imagine. Yeah.
But one thing you wish you knew once you finished it before you'd started, is there anything that, wow, I wish I knew I could have done X, when I...
Yes, several things.
Okay.
I wish I'd known just how many drawings I was going to have to do. And I'm going to get into a little detail with that, but bring me back and I'll tell you a few others.
Yeah.
I had very few references other than some of Chris Burns'
Burns.
Charles Burns, yes, thank you.
And he's the person who most leaped to mind. Like when I first saw the first few panoramas in the bar, I thought,
oh, good.
Oh, those are Burnsy, and like the early phantasmagorical Charles Burns stuff. So,
I just love his stuff. And I had picked up The Hive and loved it. And I think there were 55, 60 pages. And I thought, well, okay, well, that's doable. Yeah. And I thought I would do maybe 3, in the Limbo Lounge series. And I was so happy after working for quite a long time. I sent Craig the first book, the first 55, 60 pages. And he called and paused. And I thought, oh, no. And he said, well, Dave, nothing happens. And I said, well, it's going to. This is just part 1. And he said, yeah, but, we want people excited enough about part 1 to come back and, there's not going to be anyone there for part 3. Yeah. And so he wanted me to do it all at once. And, I was game. I wanted to do it. I wanted to work with him and I wanted to tell the story. But it ended up being around 420 drawings, I think, total. And I'm much faster and comfortable in black and white. And this great children's book author, D.B. Johnson, I think. God, I'm so sorry if I'm getting it wrong.
I'll look it up. We'll put it in the show notes.
He did this amazing series on Henry Thoreau. And Henry is a bear character. And it's just amazing work. I'm a big fan. And he's been very helpful. We've gotten to know each other online. And he said, do it in black and white. Here, I'll take one of your drawings. And he said, literally, this took me 1 minute. And
you realized, I could just do this on the computer after.
Yes, but this was halfway through, and I thought, well, I'm just going to keep doing it the way I'm, comfortable. Yeah. And so that was one thing. Okay, and the other, of course, was, it had to be one instead of three books.
And I guess that's that question of what did you learn about storytelling in the process of
so
this?
much. I'm not a writer, but like I said, I kind of created these characters and their world, and in my mind there were rules, to follow to some extent, and the story just very much unfolded for me, and I wanted it to go from hell to limbo, and I wanted it to keep changing every once in a while just to keep it a little livelier. And then, of course, at the end, it literally breaks through into one other world. I learned I could do it. That's, that's.
You see, it's something I wonder about with prose writers. It's one thing, but with a cartoonist, going back and editing and changing and realizing you went down the wrong path, to me, and with work that's so involved like yours is, I couldn't imagine I have to scrap X number of pages or X number of drawings, as opposed to maybe I could figure out some way of salvaging this that doesn't involve throwing out work I've done.
Luckily, I didn't do a lot of that. Okay. Often, if anything, I had done an original drawing in black and white that ended up having to be in color because, it was in limbo.
For the reader or for the listener, we'll say hell is in black and white and limbo is in color.
Yeah.
Very garish color.
Very,
or at least Lounge Lizard.
Nicotine stained, I was going for. Nicotine stained jewel tones. But bring me back. Where were we for that one?
Work that you did in black and white that had to be
Yeah. And there were a few things story-wise that I had to change, and some that didn't make it in. But for almost everything in the book, I've got at least 2, if not 3 or 4 versions in different. I mean, it was a ridiculous amount of overkill on my part. And there was one thing. I'm so glad I didn't go down this route. The little pageant queen is very manipulative, and I early on had imagined her having to teach the goons how to forage in hell for the right minerals to make a bomb. And, luckily I didn't get into that at all visually. And then I realized in my sketchbook that I was drawing a lot of the background characters from. I had done one character that had a bomb for a head. Well, there you go. We'll have a non-smoking section of explosive heads. And that, I hope it wasn't too pat, no,
it was great. It was one of those, trying to figure out the resources that were around you and how you're going to MacGyver your way out of a
literally, it was there. And I've had a couple people tell me that they were their favorite characters, like saying,
two guys with heads, smoking away.
Yeah.
Where does all the iconography and imagery come from for you? What were your influences, I guess, in those terms, both in terms of artistic style and that sort of content?
That's a really good question.
I know it's overbroad, but yeah.
One thing that happened years ago, I had this dream job for Newsweek where they were doing a feature on aliens, and they invited a number of illustrators to each do their own alien. And they had already gotten H.R. Geiger?
Yeah. I know it's got to be pronounced
Giger
differently
or
than
Geiger.
That because he's Dutch or something.
Yeah.
But still.
But
we'll
I thought, oh my God. So I came up with probably two dozen different aliens because I was in heaven, just having so much fun. And a lot of the ones that didn't, in fact, that was killed. It wasn't a feature and it didn't run on the cover. And the only ones that ran were Geiger and one other, I think. But meanwhile, I had, a folder of at least 2 dozen characters, and some of them made it definitely into the Limbo book. I know in the first spread that shows the characters at the bar, the 4 characters, there's one on the left that I always called Goat Girl, and she's eating garbage out of a bowl. And she was one of the aliens sketches that I came up with for the Newsweek article. But, you know, beyond that, I kind of wanted some sort of pop-looking imagery, like the bomb, you know, the ball with the, you know, typical fuse. And I wanted a combination of organic, monstery kind of things mixed with things that were a little more pop, like that, I think.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm wondering. The pop culture imagery, was that the sort of stuff that you had in your youth that you just kind of
undoubtedly
when you were always drawing?
Undoubtedly, yeah. It's in there, and in the movie that I'm working on, that is for sure a thing. All these references.
We may as well ask. Tell us about the movie you're working on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's very much a tentative thing, but I would love to promote it a little here, even though it's not an official thing yet. But it takes place in this vintage mobile park, vintage mobile home park, trailer park, and it's very well. It's a revenge murder mystery. It's actors. It's not animation, and the styling is very Munchkinland. Goth. So it's creepy. Well, Munchkinland's a little creepy to begin with, but it's trailers in Munchkinland with, I'm going to have hollyhocks, even though it's in the desert. And you know, remember the huge hollyhocks in Munchkinland. And I've been collecting things like vintage Halloween masks from my time, like well, I've got Jackie Kennedy and JFK and a Blondie and a Dagwood and a Casper and a Captain Kangaroo, and I've been collecting these amazing, Roz knows these decals from our childhood earlier than you that were very often on cribs, on maple wood, and they're photographs of stuffed animals like teddy bears and things with flowers around them, and they're just delightful and a little surreal. And one of the characters has them all over her kitchen, and with other very odd dolls, mostly, including a flying Barbie doll that literally flies, and it's very Limbo Lounge tone-wise, but set in a sort of reality on Earth.
And that sort of storytelling, again, I know it's not shooting, but trying to figure out the story for that in comparison to...
That's, again, another really good question. There are absolutely a few parallels. One is, character-wise, the little beauty pageant evil character in this exists in the first character who is murdered. But she's elderly. Yeah. And she still, looks good and, likes to show off. And so she's in a very similar outfit. It's a little bit more, kind of princessy with cleavage showing. And so there are more similarities than that, I think, if I were to think about it. But it's interesting. The storytelling in that was much easier for me. Maybe it was because, I live in the park where this is going to happen. I even have permission from the guy who owns this wonderful vintage place to film the first scene there. And so I know the world, and a lot of people who were there, not necessarily so much in the park, but in Palm Springs, are retired film people, and many of them from that era of these mean girl starlets that are getting killed off one by one.
And it's sort of movies that you were watching when you were a kid?
No.
Does that play into it at all? Okay, I wasn't sure if it was...
Well, except for visuals, but no, I don't think so. It's really... It's quite gory in a gothic kind of way. The first murder is this guy who's given me permission to film this first murder is in for a big surprise. This woman goes through, I mean, there are 3 different things that happen to her that are pretty horrific. And
no spoilers, because,
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm not telling him. And I warned him. But,
had you done any short films before?
No.
I wasn't sure, because I know you went to RISD with Roz Chast and the host of our podcast today, who we'll get into shortly. And you were in New York in the 70s and 80s. And
we got there in late 76, and I'm sure some of that...
I just assumed everybody was in performance art on top of everything else, that, there was a video component to being an artist here, but you're stuck with illustration?
Definitely then. I mean, we didn't branch out much. I wish I had done that. The one opportunity we're given is winter session, I think, which is only freshman year, where you can do whatever you want. And I played it very safe, but I wouldn't have been that great in film anyway. For some reason, when this came to me, I was ready for it, and actually, it was all right there in front of me, and it all just came together, and I found out that I can do it. I need help with this for sure. I need, probably a director and a producer and a director of photography.
It's more collaborative than any other form.
But I'm going to film the first thing, and I've got an actress for it who's actually a retired burlesque legend. I'll send you her photo. She's famous for setting her tassels on fire and she's amazing. She's an amazing character.
Nice.
Lucky to know her.
But can you talk a little about the New York of that era when you moved down here? Just in terms of what it was like, both in terms of getting your career started as an illustrator, and then just the cultural moment you were living through without necessarily knowing you were living through it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting. Both there, I would have to say, in Providence and in New York, and then again for me in Palm Springs, where we are right now. When we were there for New York and Providence, it was rough. It hadn't. Yeah. There were no hints of what it was going to become, and where we are now, the trailer park has just evolved into, it's getting a little more precious, which I have mixed feelings about. But yeah, when Kathy and I were here in the 76 and 77, I lived in Park Slope. She lived here in Manhattan at the Barbizon Hotel. And my 2 roommates were illustration department friends who are still very good friends, like Kathy. And I remember they both ended up being cooks, chefs, and dinner was a big deal for them. And it wasn't to me, so I really benefited from their work. My job was to do the croutons every night for the salad, which I was happy to do. Yeah. But every night we would
I'd find a way to screw that up, but go on.
Yeah. Oh, I did. It took me a long time. Of course, the main challenge is to not burn them. But every night we would come home and tell subway stories about what we had seen and been through. It was nuts what was going on in the...
I told my wife, who's not from this area, that The Warriors was a documentary.
Yes.
That's, it was hellish out here.
It was very hellish. Yeah. And the things we saw, I'll never forget. And there were a handful of very scary times for each of us. We had one friend who had an apartment on Union Street near Grand Army Plaza. He was hit in the head with a baseball bat one night and survived. I came close 2 times, I think. But, again, I'm glad I saw it like that. In retrospect, I wish I had bought a place and stayed here.
Everybody has that. If I had just bought that incredibly cheap place in the Lower East Side, I would be... Oh,
man. Yeah. Even where I lived, I had a sweet little studio walk up on Prospect Park West. was paying $210 a month for it. And several years later, it became a condo, and I think I could have bought it for $30,000, which would have been a pretty good investment, I think. But
it reminds me of Fran Lebowitz's getting to New York in the 70s thing. And I think she had said she was able to make her monthly rent driving a cab for either a weekend or 1 week.
No kidding.
And that was it. And she would spend the other 3 weeks goofing around, scribbling, columns for interview and all that. But
that makes me like her more.
The downside, she described it, she was right on the corner of Hell's Kitchen, which meant that anyone who wanted to visit her had to walk through Times Square. Especially nowadays, it makes it even worse because Times Square,
Oh, yeah.
She described it in a documentary about 10 plus years ago. Contemporary Times Square is like being in the 60s and bumping into someone in a gay bar. You'd say, no, I'm just here doing research. The same way if you're a real New Yorker and you're seen in Times Square. No, I'm just going over to Fran's place.
That is really good. Yeah, back then Times Square was nuts.
My mother used to leave us. She would go to the 2-for-1 tickets place for Broadway, and she'd leave me and my brother in a pinball arcade.
Which was right by the...
And I was like 10. My brother was 30. I was 9. My brother was 12. And people were on the nod in the corner.
Sure.
Just we're like, okay, let's just keep turning the machines on and off and try and get a free game out of this. But she had no idea what she was leaving us.
And those were right next door to all the porn stores,
Playland.
Right?
It was all right there.
Right.
And it was, like, okay, my mom doesn't quite understand that while she's trying to get cheap tickets to a chorus line,
we're in danger.
We made it through okay. It's still, it's like, we just don't quite realize what a scene and what a scenario is like. And when we look at what New York is nowadays, it's not a...
You described it perfectly. I mean, we were living in it, and we knew it was not where we wanted to be forever, but it was what it was, and we were trying
to be here. If you're going to make a career, you sort of had to be...
Definitely back then. I had to bring my portfolio around, and it was so different. There was one day a week where you could leave your portfolio, and you knew to leave the zipper in one special spot, and when you got it back, if it had moved, you knew you could bring it back the next week on that same day. Yeah. And
Roz and I joked about how there's a new New Yorker editor, which means she can start resubmitting cartoons from the last couple of years that this person's never seen. So, yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. I mean, she's got hundreds, if not thousands, she can...
I will say there's an analog to your portfolio thing, by the way. There was a basketball coach whose assistants believed he was coasting on their skills. So they would, back when game tape was actually on video cassette, they would fast forward it to like the 2-minute 45-second mark of the first quarter and give it to him. And when they got it back, they would check to see if it was in the same spot, which meant he hadn't bothered reviewing the game
course.
tape.
Well, you got to do it. I mean, if you have any suspicion, and it was pretty easy to check. And I got to admit, 9 out of 10 times they had looked at it.
Yeah,
but
still, you get that occasional one that you. How dare you not look at my work?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And do you remember your first jobs? Do you remember getting a start?
Yeah. I lucked out. I came here, I think in the April before we graduated, and I went to 3 places, and they all loved my portfolio. Esquire, New York Magazine, and I can't remember that. I think Psychology. No, Viva Magazine, which was owned by Penthouse. And they all loved my work, and I thought, okay, I'm ready.
I'm done. I've got a career now.
When I graduated, I really did I think I even called them and said, I'm graduated, I'm ready for work when you have it. And they're like, all right.
That's good to know.
It really did happen. Viva, God bless them, which is one I really wanted to be in. Visually, it was amazing. And do you know Mel Odom's work?
No.
He's this incredible illustrator who was so kind to me when I first moved here. Just astounding work on Instagram. He's posted a lot of his early work, which I just love. It was a big influence on me, and I think it was just a beautiful, very timely, very elegant, and kind of foresaw in a way the glamorous 80s that came as he was kind of coming up with it, with that sort of imagery. And he put in a good word for me with Rowan, whatever his, I was going to say Martin.
Yeah. Not gonna get us
Rowan, whatever his last name was. And it helped. And I got a job. And it even came out while I was still in Providence that summer. So I had a little published piece, I could put in there. And then, sure enough, New York Magazine called me back. And it's funny, I don't know if it was the same day or the same week, for sure, at the very least, where Psychology Today called me and GQ called me, and with good jobs. My first color piece in Psychology Today was, they did a story on lost children and whether people would help a lost child or not.
Yeah.
And so I did a little girl very much like the evil pageant
your
queen,
your
my girl
archetype. Yeah.
in that, except she didn't look evil. She looked lost and helpless, and with these people completely ignoring her. And I did 8 black and white spots for GQ. And so it trickled in. I had a job at Macy's doing the little small windows in the front vestibule, which was actually a lot of fun. And as soon as I took that, I started getting illustration work. So I only lasted about 4 months there, I think.
So no Simon Doonan experience for you. The way Simon Doonan was doing the Barney's windows for decades.
Oh, that wasn't quite going on yet. The guys at Macy's were good, and they were doing good things. And Bloomingdale's, I think, was a little more edgy. Bendel's was doing some interesting things, but no Simon Doonan yet. I would have stayed in that business if Simon had been around.
Like when there was a journalism crash, he, said to people, like, all these journalists laughed at me for keeping the Barney's job all these years, but that kept me insulated when journalism has its ups and downs. I still have this. But speaking of that, I mean, you mentioned the post 9/11, which could also be the post.com crash for illustration. How did the market change, from the late 70s when you were starting, over the course of 40 years, I guess? What have you seen in terms of how illustration is treated? How are there, fashions or things that you've fallen in or out of? How's the market change for you?
That's a real interesting question. I think the 80s.
And was there a best time for you?
Yes, the 80s. In terms of being busy, I had way more work than I could handle through the very early 90s, I think. But for me, I think the 80s, maybe it was just because of me living through it and, my age, but overall, I think things have just moved faster and faster to the point where I think each decade has a little less of an identity than it used to.
Sure.
And I think for me, that, again, maybe because I lived through it at a young age, but the 80s had a real specific feel to it. And the 90s in a sense too, but
I would say mid-90s things start to fragment and accelerate, and it becomes. And I'm just an outside observer to all that.
No,
it does seem like from like 96, 97 on, there's no identity, no style. You can say this is the 2000s.
Yeah, and I think maybe even in fashion. Yeah. I mean, now fashion. I used to get Vogue just so I could see how professional women dress, and so I could do something other than a big bow with a business. And I still get it because I love some of the photography. One guy Kathy and I went to RISD with, Stephen Klein, is still doing a lot of their photography and wonderful surreal stuff. He's got a thing in the current issue where he actually brought dirt into this amazing house, and it's like a woodland thing with all these flowers, and I still love looking at Vogue, but it sure seems to me like, remember back, the length of a dress used to define a year or like a maxi dress or a mini dress, hot pants. And, now it's just everywhere, anywhere you want to be. And I like that. I think that's good, but
it makes it tough to characterize
definitely
an era.
Yeah. Definitely, yeah.
And as far as your work went, that stretch in the 80s, when did you feel you were at your best in terms of what you were making?
Well, creatively, I feel like I'm at my best right now.
Cool. I was hoping, but
yeah,
I didn't want to imply anything. But.
Yeah, and I can still draw pretty well, and I've got my style. I think my original style has become quite watered down, which I don't mind. My original style was kind of severe, and the early 80s stuff, all the women were very severe. They had helmet hairdos, and broad shoulders, and it was very intentional, kind of a noir kind of look. Whenever I could get away with it.
And you were doing mystery book covers and things like
that.
Yeah.
I was doing a lot of murder mystery covers. Yeah, I think mostly because my stuff could be macabre without being gross. Because it was
it was stylish.
It was stylish, and there were elements of humor that I could get away with a knife in a back. And
and but you felt that period was prolific. Well, actually, the question I have: when did you feel this style was yours? When did you feel you'd gotten away from some of your influences and got
that you or something else? It's a very, very good question. And for me, it happened very gradually. The very early work, which you probably haven't seen, was, like I said, very severe. And I did a Art Direction magazine did a nice feature on me as an upcoming illustrator, and everything in it was, you would never know it was mine. It was very kind of Art Deco, machine age, a little German expressionistic. I loved the Cabinet of Dr. Calgary. But then I think partly out of necessity, but also as a natural part of evolution, I fell into something less severe, where originally the women's eyes were just kind of slits with lots of makeup, and their lips were really thin, and it became more, like I mentioned, the helmet hairdo, more kind of noir looking with the broad shoulders, and it seemed right for the time, and in retrospect, it was very right for the time, so I liked that period because I think I could see what was going on, and I developed it for that time, and I think it worked. But now I just feel way more like I'm in the zone, I'm with the book and with the movie, and I've got all these things that are, we've got a pretty low cost of living where we are, which is a huge blessing. And
how far are you from LA in Palm Springs?
2 hours.
Okay.
Yeah. And a lot of people from LA can't wait to get out, and they come to Palm Springs. So we, like people like Brad Benedict I mentioned earlier, we see him at least once every 2 months. And so we feel kind of plugged in still because there is so much energy coming there. Yeah.
And without having to be in the middle of the thrum.
Oh yeah, everyone in LA wants to get out of there, from what I can see.
And the other thing, because my LA experience is solely consists of interviewing interesting people, and I don't know if I'm that far off. It seems to me that every single person there has a screenplay. But it might just be only the people I sit down with. But it seems that everyone who's there is there for entertainment purposes, and I'm sure there are people who are not in LA to make a living in show business, but I've yet to meet any of them.
Gotcha.
So, I could imagine. What are you better at drawing?
What am I better at?
Yeah. What did you over the years realize you could do now that you couldn't do
40 years ago?
Well, I'm real good at hands.
That's a toughie. That's
Yeah.
That's where I gave up on drawing when I was like 9 years old.
Oh, I know. When we were at RISD, you'd walk around to see what people are doing, and the last thing they do are the hands, or they'd try and find a spot,
There's a coffee mug in front of the hand.
Yes, yeah, or it's under a leg or something. But and again, it just kind of evolved with my illustration to the point where I love doing them, and there's a kind of natural flow that I've got. I'd be in real trouble if I had to do a foreshortened version, but in where I do them, it's fairly easy for me, and I love working in black and white on illustration board. I can really get this quality that I'm after. People like my color, which I'm very happy about, but I'm always fighting the grain of the paper, and it takes me so much longer to do the color, and even after all this time, I don't have a really good, effective process for the color.
And have you ever considered drawing digitally?
I retouch digitally.
Yeah, no, I mean doing the original drawings digitally, because it's a real schism for people. Roz has mentioned doing that for fun on the iPad, but it's weird.
I don't think I've seen what people can do on it, and it blows my mind, but I don't know how to do it. And there's, I like my process with the black and white. I like doing it, and it's a ridiculous process. Like anything I do, I take the longest way around, but I like get it going, and then I take my kneaded eraser and I lift it all up, and it's beautiful. It's just all, this beautiful tone, and then I develop it a little more and lift it off again.
Yeah. Have you ever done video of you drawing? Is there any sort of...
No.
Someone should shoot something like that just to see what the technique
How Magazine wanted to do it years and years ago, but my studio was in transition, and I think they would have gone crazy watching me.
If I go to Palm Springs sometime, at a minimum, I'll bring my phone and we can shoot something.
Sure.
Well, where is your drawing space? Is it within your home, or do you have a offsite?
It is within the house, and you wouldn't believe it. It's at my computer desk. My partner's computer desk is on the opposite side. We face each other, and our screens are so big we can't see each other. But we have a dog who's very demanding and insists that we don't work outside of the house. And
our dog holds us hostage sometimes. So yeah. What's your partner do? If that's not too personal.
He just retired.
Okay.
He couldn't take what he was doing anymore, and he was afraid he was going to get into trouble. He worked at a...
I'm worried now.
No.
This won't be evidence. That's okay.
He was a librarian at a local school district, and I think he was actually really good at it, considering that not crazy about kids, but I think he did a good job, and it just became more and more difficult for anyone at that school, but he and the music teacher in particular it's a long story, but they just kept piling on more and more stuff and keeping him just under full time so that
the benefits don't kick in.
So it was getting more and more difficult, and he quit for his sanity.
Where did comics start for you? Not in this particular Limbo Lounge, but what was your background with comics previously?
Just reading them a little bit. I've never been a Sunday comics guy. Maybe when I was a kid, I read them a little more. But it's funny, even with graphic novels, in flipping through a lot of graphic novel pages, I won't mention any, but some like big ones. Kathy's got a ton of books here, and she's got a few graphic novels, and I was flipping through a very famous one the other night, and the story is probably very compelling, but visually to me it just looked totally monotonous. It was black and white, and little variation in tone or image, and so that didn't even appeal to me. I mean, Charles Burns appeals to me.
Yeah, and again, that hallucinogenic phantasmagoria of his...
Yeah, his creatures,
the
and beautifully rendered and colored, beautiful coloring. But yeah, one of my favorite things in the Hive is very kind of like, the Shining nod in my book with the goons. He's going through. Have you seen the Hive?
Yeah.
He's going through the tunnel, and he comes across these two pig characters having sex. Remember?
Just look in and
it's just a wonderful, magical moment. It's a moment, and it made me think, okay, well, maybe I can try and do that, and people will appreciate it, and but yeah, very little background in comics, I guess.
Yeah, that's why I wondered whether there were any sorts of storytelling, templates or ideas, ways of structuring what you did, even just going from panel to panel and the spreads and everything.
Well,
whether you had, or whether that was largely intuitive and the help of your editors.
It ended up being intuitive. Craig is the comics guy. I mean, he knows everything, and he encouraged me to read. I've forgotten, it's been so long ago, but there's usually a 3-tier thing, I guess, with panels and free.
Generally, yeah, you could do a 3x3, or however you choose to do a grid.
Yeah, and
dictates what you're.
And I started doing. I'd already done quite a lot of visual stuff that wasn't finished yet, but I had things that had to be a spread, but then I'd realized that they didn't fall where they could be a spread, and so I'd have to do a transitional thing to move it to a spread page. But I really didn't know what I was doing, and I'm sure a lot of people who do know what it typically looks like noticed, immediately.
Yeah, I did one last weekend in Toronto with this Welsh cartoonist who did these wonderful comics in the 80s and early 90s, and the very heavy blacks, or black and white, very heavy blacks, thick line, etc. And if you look at pages as units, they look incredible. And he was doing a panel before we recorded with Seth, the cartoonist, who asked him about design and the page as unit. He's like, oh no, I never really thought about that. I was just going panel to panel, and they just happened to compose beautifully in this 3x3 grid, but he put no thought into it. He says,
it's funny. I wouldn't say that mine is like that throughout, but I have noticed a few instances where they work really well together, completely by accident.
Yeah, no, it seems it has a natural flow, the comics. At no point did it feel like, I don't understand why this panel leads to that panel. So that's what I was wondering, whether you had background in panel to panel storytelling, or you're a natural at, we won't say what your age is, but you're a natural in terms of
Well, I don't know about that, but I worked on it so long and kept looking, and every day I'd see it fresh, to some extent. And if I was looking at a page, I'd realize, oh, wait a minute, this needs some explaining, and I'd have to come up with a few more panels, which would push the other ones into another page, and it all kind of worked out somehow. But
it's magic.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're thinking of doing more?
I don't know. I think the story could go further, and I do love the characters that are left. But boy, I'd want to do it all in black and white, and it's not set up that way. Where they end up is not.
Well, but now there's that computer color option. So
you're right.
And I could see why you wouldn't want to do that midway through, because it could look different.
It did look a little different. It was a little more coarse. I mean, it was perfectly acceptable, but...
So maybe for a standalone book, just doing black. Not that I'm giving you career advice, but just
I appreciate it. I need it.
Yeah, the encouragement is there. I'd love to see more of this stuff. But is there an issue actually with, and this is something that's come up especially with guys who are sticking with paper and pen or pencil, materials changing over the years?
Well,
they don't make it like they used to.
There a few things that were staples to me are no longer available, although you can often find them on eBay.
Yeah, it's a finite supply of
There is. I stocked up when I could on eBay with Blackie pencils, which they stopped selling a long time ago.
Because of the name? I'm just kidding.
No. I also have Black Magic pencils, but those aren't quite right. The Blackies are an intense black without quite as much reflection or grayness as ebonies. And I just love them. And I've got enough to, hopefully I'll live a few more decades, but, I think I've got enough to last me. But there was another thing called Lumadye that was very important to me at RISD and early on in my illustration career. And it's a concentrated watercolor, very much like Dr. Martin's. And I just loved them. I could do a wash. I should go back to working that way. I would do, sketch out the page and then do a wash that would fill, the background, and that would be kind of done. And then Kathy and I both did these patterns in our work, and especially in the backgrounds of little equal marks and X's. And I would do those in water after the wash had dried, and then go over it with a paper towel or a Kleenex and lift it. And it was great. It would be it was still within that, the same tones and hues of the wash, but, it would add a dimension, a little detail that was kind of popping out. And the longer you left it on, the more would come off. And I miss that. Yeah. And I don't know what I would replace it with. Dr. Martin is around, but not quite right, and very limited color-wise, I think.
You see, it was only last year that I began doing these with illustrators, and they're very different than cartoonists. And it's usually materials-oriented. John Cuneo and Joe Chardello, people like that. It's really specific about the paper or the brushes or the types of inks, etc. that they were working with. But,
yeah, I wish I had more chats with illustrators to learn some of their material
well, I'll connect
secrets.
You if you want, but
okay. Well, D.B. Johnson, who I mentioned, knows my work and was kind enough to say that he thinks that there's probably an influence in his, which I loved hearing because I love his work. But he works on coquille board, and it instantly gives, like a pixel effect, but in a good way. And he really found his niche, and he has gone beyond that and has learned how to animate his characters and do tricks like, the black and white to color thing. And he I would love to learn some of that. And he's kind to tell me, but you really got to pay attention and
it's
and just do it over and over until, it clicks. But,
do you see that your influence on other artists?
Here and there,
without, naming names in any sort of plagiarizing way, but, is it one of those things where you saw something once and thought, somebody's making a dime off of my style?
That happened to so many
you wouldn't be the only person.
Fellow illustrators that I know, where, especially ones that were very successful, and then there would be a blatant copy where, if the real one wasn't available, they could get the other one. I was pretty lucky. I didn't see too many. There was one in the 80s who was clearly influenced by me, and ironically went to Rhode Island School of Design. And it's funny, I'm very often getting emails from friends that say, "Look, I found your illustration," and it's not me, and there are a handful that, I think may have been influenced by me that have done very well. And, that irritates me a little bit, but, God bless them. And it's not a complete ripoff. I've been really lucky.
Yes. Yeah. I remember many years ago, there was a cover design for a book by Peter Mayle that just looked like it was a Chris Ware. It was so clearly was a Chris Ware design. And you open the flap copy and realize it's not Chris. Wow.
Yeah.
He must be so irate that someone lifted this entire style to do a book design. But,
yeah,
but you can't copyright that stuff. That's,
I've got a friend whose work looks quite derivative of another illustrator, and that illustrator has been in touch with her several times and furious, absolutely furious, and dressed her down. And my friend was mortified because she does take it into a different direction, but not enough, I guess, for
you can,
the other guy.
If you're the other person, I'm sure it's you're stealing my
this was kind of borderline.
So as far as materials go, and RISD, Roz Chast asks, are Prismacolors still the acme of the colored pencil world, or do you have another choice now for colored pencils? That was the one Roz question when I asked her, do you have anything for Dave?
God bless her. She could have asked me at dinner the other night. It's Prismacolor.
Yeah.
Yeah, Prismacolor is it. And I've been working with them long enough that I know the limitations of certain colors. Some are quite translucent. But again, maybe it's because I've gotten lazy over the years, but I used to, back at RISD, do an kind of underpainting, and especially in darker, richer areas where I knew the pencil wasn't going to cut it, and it needed something behind it to, give it that weight. But, these days I just kind of, just keep doing the pencil until I build it up enough. But Prismacolor is pretty good. They're nice and rich, and there are more colors than ever, and only a few that I used all the time are gone. It's one of the few instances where there are way more colors now than there were when I began. And thank God they also do Verithin pencils, which I use for the real sharp lines and detail. And they're also Prismacolor.
Any embarrassing Roz stories from RISD? I figure, we should throw one in there if you've got something that's,
Oh, I hate to do that to her.
I guess you could tell me off mic if it's something really...
I think I probably should. And the one most fun, and I can't remember if this was Roz or another illustration friend, but we had an illustration department party one time where there was so much wine, and some students slept under their desks, and evidently there were no department parties allowed with alcohol after that. I don't know if it's still a thing or not, but
you guys broke the curve.
Well, it was so funny what we did, and again, I'm not sure if it was Roz or another.
We'll say it was someone else, so she's not.
We'll say it. Yeah, okay. Well, there was a table with the wine on it, these big jugs, and there was one just opened big jug of wine and a tablecloth, and we took it and went under the table behind the tablecloth, and we would see people's feet coming up to the table and going, "Hey, where's the wine?"
Someone must have drunk it all.
So we were down there taking care of business.
Art school worth it to you? Do you think you could have become the artist you are without the experience?
No, I'm definitely worth it, and absolutely because of the students that we were there with. Not to say that the teachers were horrible, but
it sounds like you were there with a particular cohort of
we had really
artists.
Good people, and I think that's probably usually been the case. I mean, they have a very low acceptance number of people, and so they kind of take the best of the best, and it pretty much showed. But again, it was, the students that were all really very good, and quite competitive too with one another, and being there at that time in Providence where it was a little rough. It was a good.
It's still not phenomenal. I mean, I have friends up in Providence. It's still not, super gentrified or anything, but I'm sure it was in the 70s much more.
Not even on College Hill?
Yeah. Oh, it's nicer around the colleges, but it's still, there are districts that are.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I guess I'm talking about downtown and College Hill, which seems pretty
much more hip.
Gentrified and hip now, yeah.
But the sense of that camaraderie, even with the competition, was, the big influence or the, important for you.
Yeah, I mean, I made a lot of good friends, including Roz. And, we were so young, we were just learning about, the world and illustration and the business in particular, as little as we did learn about the business. That would be one complaint that I know has changed now. I know they're much, much better about getting people in and showing you, and people want to come in. I know Martha Stewart comes and DreamWorks and to meet these students. We didn't have that happening so much when we were there. So I don't know that we were nearly as prepared for what lay out there ahead of us, but
you seem to find your way pretty well.
Yeah. Well, I moved to New York and I lucked out, and it was a good time to do it, and I had the luxury of kind of evolving. Once I got there and started getting the work and refining my style to what it became. It was really good timing because I think that was the beginning of illustrators being valued a little more, and there was much more freedom and fun. I remember another dream job for Fred Woodward. He was at Texas Monthly at the time before he went to Rolling Stone, and now he's at GQ, I think, still. But he invited a number of, probably, I would guess, 15 illustrators to remember the old ads. I'm really dating myself here. That would be inside matchbook covers or comic books, like Draw the Donkey.
Yeah.
And you send it in, and they sign you up for
like the famous artist school.
Yeah.
Well,
he wanted people to draw the cowboy for Texas Monthly, and it was just great. And can you imagine a feature like that in the 60s? I mean, things were starting to open up then, but it became so playful, and it was a good time to be an illustrator, and doors were opening and walls were coming down. So it was I think we lucked out in a way. It was still difficult, but we were at the beginning of a fun time, I think.
And tell me if it's too personal a question to ask. Folks support you going into the arts?
They were very supportive.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. And my brother was the complete opposite of me. He was the jock, but they were super supportive. They sent me to classes at the Art Museum in Rochester, and it paid off even in school at the Scholastic Art Awards that every high school does. I got the best in show, and it went to New York, and it won the Hallmark Award there. And my mom worked at Rochester Institute of Technology and was very plugged into their visual departments. And she ended up being at California Institute of the Arts, and she was the secretary to the president there. And just loved being there amongst the musicians. And John Lasseter was there when she was there, and she was friends with him, and all kinds of amazing people were going through the school then. And she'd say, "Look, here's my son. He did these illustrations." And she was, in particular, just a joy, very, very supportive, and financially.
I didn't mean that sort of support.
I
guess
I know,
as well.
But since that's what I thought you meant initially. Very little. They would help me out when I really needed it. I don't think they realized how much I needed it. The first few months, we were very poor, and Claudia and Hook and I, when we lived in Park Slope, and it's a really tired story, but my grandma had died, and one of the things I brought back was a huge, what would you call it, potato buds. It was not just a box of potato buds. It was like a gallon, not jar, tin. And we would have potato buds every night, and Hoke's mom was a gardener and would get tomatoes from her. And we ate a lot of potato buds and tomatoes, and it was okay. We got through it, and things got better. And we had each other. And on Saturday nights, we would go and get a 6-pack of Old Milwaukee beer and a bag of potato chips and get the New York Times without the other stuff that came the next morning.
Yeah.
And, we were young and happy. And
there's a period where you can live like that.
Yeah.
The problem is I have artist friends who are approaching 50 who are still...
Oh.
Yeah, see, it's one thing when you're in your 20s, you can do that and say, I'm going to make it, and in my 30s, I'll be in better shape. But
yeah. That I can't imagine.
No, it's.
I mean, I'm not making a ton of money, but I'm at a point where the cost of living is quite reasonable, and I can't. It's too, like you said, when we were young, it's one thing.
I instead went into trade magazines because I had no confidence in my own writing. So, I sort of went professional from the outset, and then pretended I have a radio show now. So this sort of, fulfills the creative aspect for me. More artist friends or non-artist friends?
I would say that's a real good question. Good question. I know. Well, I think pretty much any artist friend that I've ever had, I'm still friends with. But
which is also amazing to me. And Roz was conveying that notion too, that knowing somebody for 40 plus years.
Oh, I've been very lucky.
Rare.
And Kathy's dear friend. And whenever I would come to New York in the 80s, and I did quite often, she had a wonderful loft downtown that we were just so happy. And she was getting lots of work, and I would do work in her studio. I did 2 jobs for Anna Wintour when she was at New York Magazine, where the clothing was so expensive they didn't want to mail it to me. And so I had to come to this city and work on it. And Kathy, who you met, is lovely. She's this gorgeous woman. Even at her age, you would never guess that she'd gone to school with me. But she's tiny, and the clothing was not made for tiny people. And God bless her, she would put them on for me, and I'd take Polaroids. And I've still got one of her with. It's so funny. She looks like she's trying on her mom's clothes.
I'm envisioning one of our Lorenzo Mattotti fashion drawings of the big angular thing on these tiny.
It's
figures,
big shoulders, and it was wild. It had a white leather beret with black ribbon that went in and out, so it was checkerboard. And the coat, it was this like coat thing that was huge. And then just below it was a little bit of a skirt, so it had a lot of volume. And poor Kathy,
is not one to.
She would never wear anything like that, but God bless her. I told her I'm going to send her that drawing, and I've got the Polaroid taped to the back of it, which is hilarious. She's such a good sport.
And we laugh. My wife, because I watched no TV in the 90s, my wife and I are catching up on Frasier now on Netflix. And when you see the double-breasted suits that the younger brother Niles is wearing, they're like aprons. I mean, the jackets go almost down to his knees. And it's just one of those, when you think of how fashion's changed over different stretches, you look at it like you'd be laughed at if you walked into a room wearing that now, but that was a power suit for the 90s. That was, a perfect look.
Oh, that's funny. Didn't notice that.
Oh yeah, go back if you can. Just if you do Netflix, just catch some old Frasier reruns from the first couple seasons.
I think we're setting ourselves up now to be laughed at in the future. I had to buy pants when I came here because in Palm Springs I just wear shorts, and so I went to Banana Republic and J. Crew, and I didn't get the skinny ones, but I could only get slim.
Yeah,
but the skinny ones are like tights.
Yeah, you see guys in them who should not be wearing tights. Yeah.
And I tried on a pair and looked ridiculous. I mean,
I'm
I think at any
thin,
age, but
and I tried on pants from Eunice, this fashion line here in the U.S. or here in Soho, and couldn't get the pants over my calves. And I'm not, as you've seen, not a huge guy by any means, but I thought if pants are so narrow that I can't get them on, that's probably, they're for mutants or for, people who have some sort of predisposing disorder.
Well, I tried trying one pair on, and I couldn't get them past my feet.
Yeah.
They wouldn't come up at all.
So, closing question then, what do you miss most about the 80s?
Well, the money was pretty good coming in. I was young. I was still going out to clubs. Roz went out to clubs. Because
she is such a public persona as the neurotic hidden up in Connecticut, thing. It's
we've been talking, but it's so funny the things we caught. We're still catching up, but she and I both love fragrances, but odd ones, not over the counter. There's so many interesting ones, and she had on a great one at dinner the other night. But yeah, I wish I had gone out more than I did. I think I mentioned in that Pencil King interview. But I was so busy with work that I could rarely fly to New York for the parties. But I, even in Rochester, enjoyed going out to clubs and the, great music from the 80s. Of course, there's still great music, but, it was a time, with New Order, and there was a lot of good stuff. So I kind of missed that. That was always very late at night, which I don't miss at all anymore. Yeah. But yeah, Roz used to go to Danceteria, and she was telling me, which I never did. Kathy and I went one time to, I can never remember the number, Club 84, Club 54?
57.
Club 57, okay.
Jerry Beck talked about that place. The animation guy who went to SVA, where we'll also connect you with. I think he talked about that place and Ann Magnuson's connection to him through all that stuff.
Oh, well, Ann was very involved with Club 50.
Yeah. 50, I would say 57, but maybe I'm wrong. We'll look it up, and I'll put it in the notes.
She may have been there the night that Kathy and I went. I'm glad we went because it was odd. I think if we'd gone more often, we would have continued to go more often because it was so odd. But the night we were there, I don't know if Anne was one of the women involved with this, but there was a female wrestling event, and it was a prom queen against a very butch, not a prom queen.
Yeah.
And maybe Anne was like the master of ceremonies, the referee. But at one point, it was either Anne or the prom queen took off her stiletto, her spike heel, and threw it at the butch wrestler who ducked. And the shoe came sailing into the audience and hit a man in the face right next to us. And it hurt him. Yeah. He was cut, he was bleeding, and he was also mortified. He wasn't complaining. Yeah. He didn't want to make a scene.
You buy your ticket, you take your chances.
Yeah. Exactly. But, I feel a lot differently about it if it was me who had been hit by that shoe.
So anarchic New York is what you sort of miss, I guess, that 80s.
Yeah, that's long gone, I think, right?
I would hope.
Yeah.
Or at least for our age, it's gone, Yeah. I put our age as anyone over 30, basically.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Thank you for including me.
Together.
Yeah, it was quite a time. And the little bit I went out, I'm glad I did. I went to the Mud Club one time. I never made it to CBGB's.
Did you see the Talking Heads when you were at RISD? Were they there? Or
they were there. I think they played in the tap room a few times. I'm getting mixed up with one other group that was there, but I think they called themselves the Artistics and changed it almost immediately to the Autistics, I think. I may be getting that wrong, but
it sounds good. So, yeah.
But Chris and Tina were actually enrolled there. I think they were a year ahead of us. And Kathy still knows them. She knew them quite well. I didn't. Yeah, I mean, there were people like, not just them, but a lot of, Nicole Miller was there. I think she was 2 years older. Kathy knows her. And there were all these people. It was a time. I have a feeling, it continued to be in terms of people who went on to do great things. And I know of, through the RISD News, many of them. The guy who wrote The Cabinet of Hugo, Brian Sells.
Yeah. The one that Scorsese did.
Yes. And there's another one in development that he did, and David, I can't remember his name. There's a children's book illustrator who wins Caldecott after Caldecott, and a lot of really good people. But we had our good group, and it was our own time, and I kind of regret when we were there because we just missed the late 60s and all the war protests, and that time was like super concentrated, I think, and
in terms of social change and
art students' reaction to that. And I don't think there was much of that going on when we were there. I remember going to vote with my friend Ken, and I voted for the Democrat, McGovern?
In 72?
72?
Yeah.
And here's just a fun fact. We ran into two female students who were coming back, one of whom I became good friends with, Amy Cohen. And the young woman she was with was Kathy Vavrick, who left RISD, if not after freshman, then after sophomore year. She became one of the first and most popular contestants on Survivor. At a later age, she was certainly 40-ish. She was on one of those, not the Richard Hatch episode, but the one after. And she made it to the final three. And it was her and Amber, somebody, and an older man, Rudy, who was from Rochester, I think, which is where I'm from. And they had to balance on tree stumps as long as they could. And Amber kind of reaches over to Kathy and says, "Your breast is showing." And Kathy fell off of her truck.
That would off balance anybody's.
But she was invited back many years later for fan favorites.
Yeah.
So she had another chance, but...
And you've never had any TV or movie thing living out in Palm Springs? You've never had any weird, you need to be on our documentary or our show?
You mean as a subject?
Yeah.
No, I know some people, mostly retired people, and we're pretty good friends with Jim Frawley and his wife. And Jim, a very accomplished director. He did the original Muppet movie.
Yeah.
And a very interesting character. Used to hang out with Dennis Hopper, who was in his first movie, and Bob Dylan, I think, and Jack Nicholson and Bob Rafelson. And they owned huts in Mexico and would go there like a, boys' weekend, and they really had quite an adventurous life. And Jim, 80 years old or so, and not nearly I mean, he can't be
so
so adventurous anymore, but boy, we love hearing his stories. And Cynthia was a Helmut Newton model, and it just very interesting characters. But no, I don't really. I hope to have some involvement in film, but
when you get the movie going.
Yeah, sure. But nothing up to this point. I did meet Ronnie Blakely from Nashville, and in fact, I may see if she would like to have a part if the movie happens. I think she would do it. I met through Suze, the one who I met.
Who was Russ Meyer's
the burlesque agent. Yeah. She also knew.
For a kid from Rochester, you seem to have led a pretty adventuresome life.
You
know, at least, you
I've
make a lot
lucked out. And in Palm Springs, one of my first introductions is to this wonderful woman, Suze, who we're still good friends with. And I met Ronnie Blakely and Kit Natividad, and I spoke with Teresa Tana on the phone one time. And I wasn't there. I was out of town, but my partner John went to lunch with Suze and Ronnie Blakely and another woman. And I asked John from the photo, "Who's that?" And he said, "Oh, I don't know. I didn't really talk to her that much. It was Viva from the factory." So I hope to meet Viva one day, since we have a mutual friend. But yeah, I think that's one reason I feel blessedly creative right now, because I've got some really interesting friends that I see pretty regularly. And, it's a good balance. I've got a good, steady home life and routine that I find very important. But I've got all this tangential stuff that is so exciting and kind of feeds on one another, and it's just very interesting. I'm really lucky to have all these things.
It's remarkably parallel to my life, in terms of nice, steady life out in the suburbs.
Okay,
job,
you get it.
And I have something like this where I get to meet people like you.
Well, and likewise.
On the other hand, that means I find you interesting, where you yourself consider yourself boring. But, I find you immensely interesting.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that.
So, Dave, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. It's a pleasure to know you.
And that was Dave Calver. His new book is Limbo Lounge from Yo Books, and it's a joy. I think we conveyed some of the sheer fun of this book, and I hope you can go to the show page for this site or to Dave's site, davecalver.com, to see some examples of that amazing illustrative style of his. Now, davecalver.com is DAVECALVER.com. He's also on Facebook under that name, as well as Twitter as Dave Calver 12, that's the numbers 12, and on Instagram as Dave Calver Art, all one word. You should definitely pick up the Limbo Lounge and make sure to check out Dave's illustration work. He's a singular figure. Now, after we wrapped, I asked Dave, "So, who are you reading?" If you want to hear his answer to that question, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The newest episode of that one features 40 minutes of new material from Dave McKean, Paul Karasik, Mark Newgarden, Seymour Quast, John Leland, Ann Hulbert, Henry Wessels, Lauren Weinstein, Jerry Beck, Willard Spiegelman, Levi Tadar, Jesse Scheidlauer, and Robert Weil. Since this is the last week of the quarter, I guess I'm going to get started on the next one. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. There are all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, and now this new secret project, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this episode at the home of Dave's pal, Kathy B. Graham, in New York City. It was on the Upper East Side, Central Park East, actually. So I had the toll at the George Washington, about $25 for parking, and $9 for coffee and a donut because, as I mentioned, it was the Upper East Side. So if you want to help me defray some of the cost of the Virtual Memories show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee and donuts, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Stephen Nadler, Wallace Wilde Manozzi, Noah Van Sciver, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Michael Hacker, Craig P. Steffen, Jack Lescamella, Joe Caruso, Paul Karasik, Michael Janizik, and Stephen Solomon for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. Next week's guest will be illustrator and artist Mark Ulrichsen. Until then, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at Facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. Oh yeah, and Spotify also. If you find the show there, let me know. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes Store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll help us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.